So I'm Ashley Sparrow. I've got the longest project title. It's the only one that makes 2 lines in the agenda. And the reason for that is that historically it started off as 3 potential projects at the early stages of the CRC. But during the discussions over the last 12 months, it's evolved into a single cohesive area. And that's because really it's driven by the relationships between climate adaptation, carbon economies and energy futures, all essentially being directly responsive to increasing atmospheric CO2 and or climate change as experienced in remote Australia. And I've just suggested that post-peak oil is another driver of the energy futures side, but probably doesn't drive the other 2. Those broad headings can be deconstructed, and for me this means that the project has a very broad scope. I could do everything from ecosystems, which is my background as an ecologist, right through to aspects around culture and health, which are really pushing the limits of my expertise. But I would see that there's an essential requirement for interfacing with other projects around climate adaptation processes. There's a whole pile of interactions there, and it's really those interactions which I think has driven the move towards having a single large integrated project rather than regarding climate adaptation, carbon economies and energy futures as independent topics. The broad scoping questions are essentially these then. What are the climate scenarios for remote Australia? What's the adaptive capacity and vulnerability around ecosystems, individuals and communities, primary and secondary industries, infrastructure and so on? What are the opportunities for carbon emissions abatement and economic benefit from that? What are the opportunities for alternative energy and what are the economic potential for that? And of course there's a whole suite of social and economic aspects of that. I'm currently working on a background literature document towards the stakeholder workshop, which is 23-24 of August, and I'd love to have discussions about whether people wish to participate in that because of the potential interfaces around especially climate adaptation, but possibly also energy futures and carbon economies. I regard those 3 topics as relatively self-explanatory because they're in the news so much at the moment, and I don't want to go over those in detail. But one thing I will say is I see the political topicality as a real challenge for me because there's the danger of becoming very reactive to what was the last government announcement. So Julia Gillard announced a price for carbon the Sunday before last, and all the state and territory governments are now rushing around trying to work out how to access the federal government funding sources and how they might need to adjust their own local policies in reaction to that. That's a problem for me in some ways because I'm looking at a 5-year research project under this particular banner, and I need to be able to identify the more fundamental and enduring issues that are still going to be here in 5 years' time, regardless of whether there have been changes in any of the governments or the policies of those governments. So I'm really interested in aspects to do with horizon scanning, those really core long-term issues, but being able to look at the short-term political cycles as a lens through which we might be able to take opportunities for funding and engagement and so on. And of course I've already suggested that there's issues around interfaces with other projects where, for example, health or cultural aspects are really stretching the biophysical and economic basis of the project as originally scoped. There's a whole heap of conceptual models that people present around vulnerability to climate change and potential adaptation or taking advantage of opportunities. I've tried to synthesise them here in my own way. This is more as a straw person rather than to suggest that it's a good model. But we have climate change and increasing atmospheric CO2 through a series of processes or filters which have direct aspects on those sorts of dimensions that I was listing earlier. We can analyse those impacts in terms of the way people and businesses might need to respond, find solutions, adopt innovations and so on. And then there's the final issue to do with all the filters which apply to whether we can actually implement any of those innovations within the socio and economic framework. The first part of that process is really around the expected socio-ecological changes as a result of climate change. The second part is to do with adaptation options, and there's a whole pile of literature about discussing those with different language. Under the three banners that make up this project, different aspects of this are differentially understood. So, for example, there's an enormous number of energy future solutions out there, potential solutions. There's a raft of technologies, and it may not be necessary for this project to tackle the technologies, but the issues to do with implementation of any or some combination of those opportunities is much more challenging. When it comes to climate change, actually some of these earlier phases are equally poorly understood, I should say. Central Australia's predictions on climate change are more variable than anywhere else. And it's not just because the climate here is generally variable. Actually, the models give you a larger variance, and therefore there's an enormous risk structure associated with decision making. We actually don't know what the future's going to be, and there's the possibility that at least some research might need to be done in there, or that we need to align this project with others who are working in that space. The same is probably true of carbon. If we're thinking of managing carbon.
You've got 30 seconds.
All right. If we're thinking of managing carbon, the Savannah northern part of Australia is well done. If you're under 1,000 millimetres rainfall, we actually have no methodology to be able to predict what the actual biophysical opportunity is before we get to social or economic decision making. I'll stop there.